parable about blessing. A fable about population, blessing. It happened once on a planet not much different from our own, that researchers at a drug company got lucky with a substance they were testing as a pain reliever. Ingesting this substance, called D3346, pain-ridden mice began to exhibit signs of relief. They were friskier, they mated more often, their appetites improved, and so on. Human tests made company officials ecstatic. D3346 outperformed much more powerful drugs and had no deleterious side effects, aside from imparting to the subject an objectionable odor that soon disappeared when the drug was discontinued. The new drug worked so well that the marketing department knew they had more on their hands here than a mere painkiller. People put up with a host of small aches and pains more or less all the time, and simply by getting rid of them, D3346 gave users a feeling of well-being so intense that it almost amounted to a high. The name Blessing was adopted for the new product without discussion, as was its slogan, "Works on pain you didn't even know you had." The drug was initially marketed in pill and liquid forms, but in less than a year, someone had the bright idea of packaging it as a powder in disposable shakers designed to take their place beside the salt and pepper on the dining room table. Within months, all medicinal forms had disappeared from store shelves and pharmacy shelves, and blessing was no longer taken for pain. It had become just another beneficial food additive, like a vitamin. No one was surprised when, 9 months after the introduction of the drug, the birth rate began to climb. This had been predicted, and everyone understood the reason for it. Blessing didn't increase fertility or sexual appetite. It wasn't an aphrodisiac. People using it just felt better, more playful, more affectionate, more outgoing. It was predicted that the birth rate would soon level off, and it did, at about 10% above the old rate. On this planet, the people I've been talking about did not constitute a dominant world culture, as we do, but they soon began to be noticed globally. In the first place, they smelled bad, which earned them the name by which they became known all across the world, the Stinkards. In the second place, responding to internal population pressures, they were incorrigible trespassers and encroachers. Nonetheless, the Stinkards usually managed to do their encroaching without violence by sending blessing ahead of them. It didn't matter that no one wanted to end up smelling like the stinkers. The blessing was there, and few could resist taking just an occasional dose for a sore back or headache. And before long, they were using it like table salt. People began by loathing the Stinkards and passionately resisting their encroachments, but ended up becoming Stinkards themselves. After a few hundred years, the Stinkard expansion came to an end, because there were no new lands to expand into. The entire planet was Stinkards. Far-sighted leaders realized that population was soon going to be an urgent problem, but a century passed without significant action being taken. The human population, having no reason to do anything else, continued to grow. Famine became a familiar feature of life in certain parts of the world, and in some quarters the problem became to be understood not as one of curbing growth, but as one of increasing food production. Another century passed and the human population continued to expand. In informed circles, people began to practice and advocate various population control strategies, ranging from birth control in one form or another to school programs designed to reduce teenage pregnancies But none of these initiatives had any measurable effect. As more and more people became aware of the crisis, sociologists and economists began to probe deeply for its causes. They noted, for example, that in many parts of the world, having children was a means of financial success. Lacking other economic opportunities, especially for women, people brought children into the world to serve as unpaid workers and guarantors of old age security. One biohistorian by the name of Spry tried to draw people's attention to the fact that before the appearance of blessing, the human population of the planet had been virtually stable. But his listeners had a hard time seeing the connection between the two things. Dr. Spry tried to explain, if you introduce blessing into the diet of any species, he said, the result will be the same. The birth rate will increase. Without any offsetting increase in the death rate, the species' overall population will inevitably increase as well. The professor's listeners really had no notion of what he was getting at, since blessing had been a constant feature of the human diet for 1,000 years, and they couldn't begin to imagine how it would feel to live without it. And they couldn't imagine how it felt to live without it. He had to explain very patiently that without a constant intake of blessing, everyone would experience a whole host of minor aches and pains. And experiencing these minor aches and pains, they would be slightly less frisky, slightly less playful, slightly less affectionate, slightly less outgoing, and slightly less inclined to mate. As a result, the birth rate would go down and the population would soon become stable once again. Are you saying that the solution to our problem is to live in pain? People ask him incredulously. That's a complete exaggeration of my point, the professor said. Before blessing came along, people didn't think of themselves as living in pain. They were not living in pain. They were just living. Others said, this is really all beside the point. Dr. Spry has already pointed out that blessing isn't an aphrodisiac and doesn't in itself increase fertility. The fact that we use blessing doesn't compel us to mate more often. We can mate as little or as much as we want. What's more, we can also use any number of contraceptive methods to avoid pregnancy. So it's hard to see what blessing has to do with the matter at all. It has to do this with it, Dr. Spry replied. If you make blessing available to any species, the members of that species will mate more often, and their birth rate will rise. It's not a question of what you or I will do, whether you or I will elect to use contraceptives, for example. It's a question of what the species as a whole will do. And I can demonstrate this experimentally. The birth rate of any species with free access to blessing will increase. It doesn't matter whether it's mice or cats or lizards or chickens or humans. This isn't a matter of what individuals do, this is a matter of what whole populations do. But the professor's audiences always indignantly rejected this observation. We are not mice, they would yell. We are not cats or lizards or chickens. Increasingly regarded as a crank and an extremist, Dr. Spry eventually lost his teaching post and with it his credibility as an authority on any subject and was heard from no more. The population crisis mounted. Environmental biologists estimated that the human population had already exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet and was headed for a catastrophic collapse. Even former scoffers and optimists began to see that something had to change. Finally, the heads of state of the major world powers convened a global conference to study and discuss the issues. It was an impressive event, unprecedented in human history. Thousands of thinkers from dozens of disciplines came together to put the problem under scrutiny. The concept of control soon emerged as the overriding theme of the conference. Population control, of course, was the subject itself, but achieving control of population implied control on all sorts of levels, in all sorts of ways. New economic controls would encourage couples to control family size. In backward lands, where women were little more than breeding machines, new social controls would release their creativity to enhance family prosperity. Birth control devices, birth control substances, birth control strategies needed wider dissemination. Naturally, on the level of the individual, personal control needed to be improved. Educational controls were hotly debated, with some arguing that controls were needed to keep children ignorant about sex, while others argued that controls were needed to make children aware of sex. Control, control, control. It was a word heard 10,000 times, a million times. Unlike the word blessing. At the Stinkards Great Global Conference on Population, blessing wasn't a major topic, or even a minor topic. In fact, blessing wasn't even mentioned once. Okay, this was the parable of blessing in the Stinkards by Daniel Quinn in his book, The Story of Bee. Daniel Quinn's books have a very green lingo, but they're much deeper. And the guy was quite awake himself. So this is a very good parable, and I will choose some more in the future that are very similar to ancient Sufi parables. There's a very important message in there that can only be told by a parable or metaphor or story. I won't tell you what the message of the story is. That's for you to find out, but it's a very important one. Have fun with it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for joining me on Patreon and for sharing the videos with your friends. And see you soon.